He grew up in a mansion with everything money could buy, but one thing was always missing: his mother. Every time he asked his father, he got the same cold answer: "She's not part of our lives." For years he wondered. For years he felt that empty space. Until one night, sick with a high fever, he noticed something on the maid's neck, a birthmark, the exact same one he had. That moment changed everything. What he discovered after would turn his world upside down. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Ethan was a 6-year-old boy who lived in a very big and expensive house with his father, Richard. Richard was a billionaire and gave Ethan everything money could buy: huge rooms full of toys, games, and even a private playground in the backyard. The house had many workers, people who cooked, cleaned, and took care of everything. But even with all these things, Ethan didn't feel happy. He didn't feel complete. Every time he looked around the house, he noticed someone important was missing: his mom. He didn't know who she was or where she went. Whenever he asked Richard about her, his father would simply say, "She's not part of our lives." That was it. No more answers, no details. Ethan didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to know more. Everyone avoided talking about her. Even though he had so much, it always felt like something big was missing from his world. Among all the workers in the mansion, there was one person Ethan liked the most: Grace. She wasn't just another employee. She was the one who gave him his meals, told him bedtime stories, and even hugged him when he felt sad. Grace smiled a lot, but Ethan could tell that behind her smile, she was hiding something. Sometimes, when he asked her simple questions like, "Did my mom look like me?" or "Did you know her?" Grace would pause and change the subject. Her eyes would get wet like she wanted to cry, but she never did. Ethan noticed how she looked at him, almost like she cared more than anyone else did. But he also felt she was holding something back, like she wanted to tell him something but wasn't allowed. This made Ethan even more confused. Why would someone who cared so much hide things from him? He trusted her more than anyone, but even she wouldn't give him the answers he needed. Ethan didn't have any friends to talk to. He wasn't allowed to leave the mansion, and other kids never visited. Every day felt the same. He would play alone, eat alone, and wonder alone. The toys were fun for a while, but without someone to share them with, they quickly became boring. He tried asking Richard again about his mother during dinner one night. "Why don't I have a mum like the other kids?" he asked. Richard didn't even look up from his food. "She doesn't matter. That's all you need to know." Ethan stared at him, hoping for more, but his father didn't say anything else. That night, he asked Grace again. She held his hand, took a deep breath, and said softly, "Sometimes people we love aren't here anymore, Ethan." But he didn't understand what that meant. Was his mom gone forever? Was she dead? Or did she just leave him? No one would say anything clearly, and that made everything worse. At night, Ethan often had strange dreams. In these dreams, he would see a woman with soft eyes and warm hands. She never spoke, but she always smiled at him. Sometimes she would reach out like she wanted to hug him, but then she would fade away. When Ethan woke up, he always felt empty, like someone he loved had just disappeared. He would lie in bed, holding his pillow tightly, trying to remember the woman's face. Was that his mom? He didn't know. It was the same dream over and over again. He started to wonder if his mind was showing him what he missed most. Maybe his heart was trying to tell him something. Every time he dreamed about the woman, he would wake up with questions. Why couldn't he see her clearly? Why did no one tell him the truth? His days were filled with silence, and his nights were full of mystery. One morning, Ethan walked through the hallway and stopped at the large photo wall near the stairs. It had pictures of Richard at events, with important-looking people in fancy places. But there were no pictures of Ethan's mom, none. Not even one. He checked the photo albums in the library, but it was the same thing. She was nowhere to be found. It was like she never existed. He went to Grace and asked again, "Why aren't there any pictures of my mom?" Grace gave him a long hug but didn't answer. Instead, she said, "You are so loved, Ethan. That's what matters." But Ethan didn't agree. He needed to know who he was and where he came from. He started to feel that everyone around him was keeping a secret, a big one, and it was about his own life. He promised himself that one day he would find out the truth, even if no one wanted to help him. That night, like so many others before, Ethan lay in his bed feeling alone. The room was quiet, the lights were dim, and he looked up at the ceiling thinking about the woman in his dreams. She felt familiar, like someone he should have known but never met. He tried to stay awake, hoping that maybe if he stayed up, the dreams wouldn't come. But slowly, his eyes closed, and once again he saw her. She was standing far away in a place he didn't recognize, holding out her arms as if waiting for him. He tried to run to her, but no matter how fast he moved, she stayed just out of reach. Then, like always, she faded away. Ethan woke up with tears in his eyes and a feeling of emptiness in his chest. The mansion was quiet again. Richard was asleep. Grace was downstairs. Ethan sat up in bed, staring at the darkness, still a boy full of questions, still without answers. Richard was not only rich, he was also strict. He liked to control everything inside the mansion. Nothing happened without his permission. He decided what food was served, how the staff dressed when they worked, and even what they were allowed to say. One rule was very clear. No one was allowed to talk about Ethan's mother. Not even a word. Richard had made this rule clear to every worker. If anyone broke it, they would lose their job right away. He didn't care who it was. He didn't want the name of Ethan's mother mentioned in the house. This made everyone nervous. Grace, the housekeeper who cared for Ethan like a second mother, followed the rule even though it hurt her inside. Every day she watched Ethan grow up with questions no one was allowed to answer. She wanted to speak the truth, but she was scared. She didn't want to lose her job, or worse, be separated from the boy she loved like a son. Grace wasn't the only one who felt bad. Many of the workers looked uncomfortable around Ethan. He began to notice it more and more. When he entered a room, people would stop talking. If he asked a question that was even close to being about his mother, they would freeze, smile awkwardly, and quickly change the subject. One day, Ethan saw two maids whispering in the hallway. As he walked closer, they stopped, looked at him, and walked away without finishing their sentence. Ethan felt confused. It was like everyone was hiding something from him. He wasn't just imagining things. Something strange was going on, and he was sure it had to do with his mom. He didn't understand why no one wanted to talk to him about it. He felt lonely, like he was walking through a place where everyone wore a mask. He was just a kid, but even he could feel the pressure in the air. Ethan decided to try another way. One afternoon, while walking through the kitchen, he stopped to speak to the head cook, Maria. She had always been kind to him. "Maria," he asked, "do you know anything about my mom?" Maria's eyes widened. Her hands, which had been chopping vegetables, suddenly stopped. She looked down, didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then gave a forced smile. "You should ask your father, dear," she said, without meeting his eyes. Then she picked up the vegetables and turned her back to him. Ethan stood there, unsure of what just happened. He felt embarrassed, like he had done something wrong, but he also knew he didn't. He had every right to ask about his own mother. Why was everyone so afraid? Why couldn't anyone give him a straight answer? He started to feel like he was surrounded by a wall of silence, and every time he tried to climb it, it got taller. Things got even worse a few days later. There was an older gardener named Thomas who worked on the mansion's large gardens. He had been around since before Ethan was born. Thomas always smiled at Ethan and sometimes gave him apples from the tree behind the garage. Ethan trusted him. One afternoon, while they were walking near the flower beds, Ethan asked him quietly, "Did you know my mom?" Thomas stopped walking and looked at Ethan. "Yes, she..." But before he could finish, he froze. He looked around quickly, like someone might be watching. The next day, Thomas was gone. His tools were still in the shed, but he never came back. Grace told Ethan that Thomas had been let go. No one explained why. Ethan knew it was because of what he said. That short sentence, that single word, "she," had cost Thomas his job. Ethan felt guilty, and he also felt angry. What kind of place punished people for telling the truth? After Thomas left, the atmosphere in the house became even heavier. The mansion was big and full of expensive things, but it no longer felt exciting or fun. It felt like a giant prison with golden walls. There were many rooms, but none felt warm. Ethan started spending more time alone. He stopped asking questions because he already knew what would happen. Silence, fear, or people getting fired. He started to write his thoughts in a little notebook he hid under his bed. He drew pictures of the woman from his dreams and wrote questions like, what was her name and why did she leave? He didn't know if he would ever get answers, but writing made him feel less trapped. Sometimes, he saw Grace looking at him with sad eyes, like she wanted to help, but couldn't. The mansion was beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, it was a place full of secrets, rules, and silence. Ethan sat by the window that evening, looking out at the garden where Thomas used to work. He watched the wind move the flowers and wondered if things would ever change. He missed Thomas. He missed the little jokes they shared, the stories, and the feeling that someone was honest with him. Now he felt more alone than ever. He turned his eyes toward the hallway, where he could see the other staff walking quickly, avoiding his gaze. It was clear that Richard's control reached every corner of the mansion. No one dared to speak freely. Grace walked in with his dinner, placed it gently on the table, and gave him a soft smile. She didn't say anything. Ethan didn't ask anything. The silence was stronger now. It filled the room like heavy air. As he picked at his food, he couldn't stop thinking that there was a huge secret in the mansion. And somehow, that secret was about him. Grace couldn't talk about the past, but she could show her love through small things. She was the only person in the house who treated Ethan with real care. Every morning, she made breakfast just the way he liked it. Warm toast with strawberry jam and a glass of cold orange juice. She knew when he was in a bad mood and gave him space. She read stories before bed, even when she was tired after a long day of work. When Ethan got sick, she stayed by his side all night, bringing medicine and wet towels for his forehead. She didn't complain. She never treated him like it was just her job. She looked at him differently than anyone else did. Ethan noticed this. One day, while she fixed his blanket, he asked, "Why are you different from the others?" Grace paused. She smiled, but the smile was shaky. She didn't answer, just kissed his forehead gently and walked out of the room. Richard wasn't blind. He saw the bond between Ethan and Grace, and it made him angry. He didn't show it right away, but it was obvious in how he started treating Grace differently. He began giving her extra work, more than anyone else. He asked her to clean areas of the house she never had to before, told her to handle extra laundry, and even made her help the cook in the kitchen. It wasn't because she wasn't doing her job. It was because Richard wanted her away from Ethan. He thought it was dangerous for them to become too close. He didn't like it, but Grace accepted everything in silence. She didn't argue, she just worked harder. Ethan noticed that she wasn't around as much, and he didn't like it. He started going into the laundry room just to see her folding clothes. He would sit on a stool and talk to her about anything, even if she barely replied. He just needed her close. Ethan began to feel that Grace wasn't just a kind person. He didn't understand everything yet, but something deep inside him said there was more to her. Her hugs felt too real. Her voice, even when quiet, made him feel safe in a way no one else ever did. She remembered the smallest things: his favorite color, which toy he liked most, even the name of a stuffed animal he lost 2 years ago. No one remembered things like that, not even his father. It wasn't just love from a nanny, it felt like something bigger. Ethan began to think, could she be my mom? He never said it out loud. It was just a quiet thought that started to grow in his mind. He looked at her face and tried to find parts of himself there. Her eyes, her nose, her smile. Sometimes he would watch her when she didn't notice, looking for a sign. He didn't have proof, but the feeling kept getting stronger. One day, Ethan decided to test something. During lunch, while Richard was away in his office, he told Grace, "If I had a mom, I think she would be like you." Grace froze for a second, holding a spoon in midair. Then she quickly looked down and said, "That's very sweet, Ethan," and nothing more. But Ethan saw her eyes. They were wet, like she wanted to cry. She turned her back and started washing dishes. Ethan didn't say anything else, but he felt something shift. That night, after everyone went to sleep, he sat by the window in his room and tried to think clearly. What if Grace really was his mother? What if that's why Richard hated their bond? It made sense in a way that nothing else did. But why would she lie? Why wouldn't she tell him the truth? He had so many questions and no real answers. Still, the thought refused to leave him. It was stuck in his heart now. Richard noticed that his plan wasn't working. No matter how much he tried to separate them, Ethan always found ways to be near Grace. Sometimes he would pretend to be hurt just so she would come check on him. Other times, he'd sit outside the laundry room or sneak into the kitchen just to talk to her. Grace didn't push him away. She kept her distance in words, but not in actions. She still packed his school bag, tied his shoes, and made sure his room was clean and cozy. Richard became colder. He gave shorter answers when Ethan spoke and didn't join him for dinner as often. But Ethan didn't care as much anymore. Grace's kindness mattered more. He didn't want toys or video games. He just wanted to understand the truth. He started writing more in his notebook, drawing pictures of Grace, writing ideas, and even making lists of reasons why he believed she was his mother. His mind was full. Even without proof, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something real connected them, something more than just caregiver and child. He began to trust that his suspicion wasn't just a child's fantasy. It was a growing truth inside him. Every small gesture from Grace, every soft look, every moment she held back tears, it all added up. She wasn't allowed to say it, but her actions spoke louder than words, and he listened. Every day his belief got stronger. Maybe Richard was hiding more than just the past. Maybe this was why he didn't want Ethan asking questions. Maybe this was why Thomas was fired, why the mansion was filled with silence. Ethan had no evidence, but he was sure of one thing now. Grace loved him like a mother, and he loved her like a son. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he still didn't have answers, but for the first time he had a strong feeling. Something big was waiting to be discovered. It started late at night. Ethan had been coughing a little during the day, but nobody thought it was serious. By bedtime, though, his face was hot. His body was shaking and he could barely keep his eyes open. Grace was the first to notice something was wrong. She touched his forehead and felt the heat right away. Without waiting, she ran to get a wet towel and a bowl of cold water. She came back quickly and placed the cloth on his head. Ethan moved slowly, whispering things that didn't make sense. Grace sat next to him, whispering soft words and humming a quiet tune, hoping it would help him rest. She changed the towel often and brought him water to drink. She stayed beside him, even though it was very late. She didn't leave, not even for a minute. As she adjusted his pillow, some strands of her hair fell over her shoulder, exposing a small dark mark on the side of her neck. Ethan, even though he was weak and half asleep, noticed it right away. His tired eyes blinked a few times before he reached out and lightly touched the spot on Grace's neck. His fingers were warm and his hand shook a little. In a soft, sleepy voice, he said, "It's just like mine." Grace froze. She stopped breathing for a second, her eyes wide. She pulled her head back slightly, shocked. Ethan slowly turned his head and moved his collar down to show his own neck. There, on the side, was the same dark birthmark, the same shape, in almost the same place. He didn't say much else. He just smiled a little and closed his eyes again. Grace didn't say anything either. She looked down at the boy with tears welling up in her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she went back to placing a fresh towel on his head. The room was quiet again, but everything had changed in that moment. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling better. His fever had dropped, and his head didn't hurt as much. He was still weak, but he could sit up in bed. Grace brought him some tea and sat beside him like usual. But something was different. Ethan didn't forget what happened during the night. It wasn't one of those blurry fever dreams. He remembered clearly what he saw. He remembered touching her neck and seeing the mark that looked just like his own. He looked at Grace carefully. She acted normal, asking how he felt and telling him to drink slowly. But Ethan wasn't focused on the tea. He kept staring at the side of her neck, waiting to see the mark again. Grace noticed, of course. She pulled her hair over her shoulder a bit more than usual, hiding the spot. Ethan didn't mention it again, not right away. But the thought stayed in his head all day. Something real had finally shown itself. After that day, Ethan paid even more attention. Whenever Grace bent down to pick something up or leaned forward to help him get dressed, he tried to catch a glimpse of her neck. He didn't always see the mark, but when he did, he felt the same thing every time, a strange mix of surprise, hope, and certainty. He stopped doubting his thoughts. Before, the idea that Grace could be his mother felt like a dream, something his heart wanted, but his mind wasn't sure about. Now it was different. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was something he could point to, something they both shared. He even started looking in the mirror, staring at his own birthmark, tracing it with his finger. He imagined a line connecting his mark to hers, like a secret signal that no one else could see. Richard still acted distant, and the house was still quiet. But in Ethan's world, everything was shifting. Ethan didn't confront Grace about the mark again. He knew better now. He understood that she couldn't talk about certain things, that there were rules she was forced to follow, but he also knew she couldn't hide what her heart felt. When she brushed his hair, when she tucked him in at night, when she stayed up all night taking care of him, those actions said more than words ever could. He started thinking about the reasons why she had to stay quiet. Maybe Richard made her promise something. Maybe he threatened her. Maybe there was something in the past that forced her to pretend. Ethan didn't know the full story, but he was sure of one thing. Grace wasn't just a kind woman. She wasn't just a maid who cared. She was connected to him in a way that went beyond kindness. That mark wasn't a coincidence. And for the first time in his life, Ethan believed he had found a real clue about who his mother truly was. The mansion still felt cold, and Richard's rules hadn't changed, but Ethan didn't feel as lost anymore. He had something now, a piece of the puzzle that made sense. Every time he saw Grace now, he didn't just feel cared for, he felt linked. It wasn't just the stories at bedtime or the soup when he was sick. It was deeper than that. He remembered how fast Grace had reacted when he fell ill, how she stayed up all night even when no one told her to. He remembered the way she froze when he saw her birthmark, the way her eyes filled with something close to fear, or maybe guilt. Whatever it was real. That connection couldn't be denied anymore. Ethan no longer needed to keep asking everyone about his mother. Now, he only wanted to understand what had happened in the past, What had made Grace stay silent? The mystery wasn't solved yet, but it had finally begun to unfold. That morning, Ethan sat quietly at the breakfast table. The long table, as usual, had plates of eggs, toast, fruit and orange juice arranged neatly by the staff. Richard was already reading the newspaper and sipping his coffee, barely looking at his son. Ethan didn't touch his food. He stared at his father, his small hands resting on the table. Then in a calm but direct voice he asked, "Why does Grace have the same mark as me? Is she part of my family?" Richard froze. His eyes stayed on the paper for a moment, and then he slowly looked up. His face tightened. There was a short silence before he spoke, and when he did, his tone was cold and "That doesn't mean anything," he said. "Stop with these ideas. It's all nonsense." Ethan didn't back down. He asked again, louder this time, "Then who is my real mom?" Richard stood up quickly, pushing the chair back with force. "Enough," he said, and walked away. Ethan stayed at the table alone, staring at his plate. He wasn't hungry anymore. He kept thinking about his father's reaction. Richard didn't answer the question. He got angry and walked out. That said more than words. Ethan had never seen him so nervous before. Usually, Richard stayed calm and in control, but now he looked scared. Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just guessing anymore. He had asked a real question, and it made his father uncomfortable. That meant he was getting close to the truth. He thought about the mark again, the one he had on his neck, and the one Grace had in the exact same place. That wasn't a simple coincidence. He thought back to Grace's reaction when he touched her neck during the fever. She didn't deny it. She didn't explain it either. Ethan knew there was something real going on. He just had to keep pushing until someone finally told him everything. Later that afternoon, the house was quieter than usual. Richard had gone out for a meeting, and most of the staff were busy with their chores. Ethan waited until the hallway was empty before walking softly to the laundry room. Grace was folding towels and placing them in neat piles. She looked tired, and her hands moved slowly. Ethan stood in the doorway for a few seconds before speaking. "Grace," he said quietly. She turned around with a smile, but it faded when she saw his serious face. He walked closer and stood right in front of her. He didn't waste time. "Are you my mom?" he asked, his voice calm but clear. Grace froze, holding a towel in midair. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. She dropped the towel and fell to her knees, hugging him tightly. She didn't say a word. She just cried and held him like she never wanted to let go. And Ethan didn't pull away. He stayed in her arms. For a long time, they stayed there like that, just the two of them, sitting on the floor. Ethan didn't need her to say anything. Her hug, the way she cried, the way she held him, it all said more than words could. He felt her shaking. He could feel her tears on his shoulder. And even though he didn't cry himself, something heavy inside him finally started to lift. It was like his heart already knew the truth, and now it had been confirmed. Grace was his mother. Maybe the world didn't know. Maybe Richard didn't want it to be said. But Ethan knew now. Grace pulled back slightly and looked at him. Her face was red, her eyes still wet, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just held his face in her hands and nodded very slowly, as if to say yes without actually saying it. That small nod was enough for Ethan. From that moment on, everything looked different to him. He walked through the house, seeing things with new eyes. Every time Grace helped him, smiled at him, or even just passed him in the hallway, it had new meaning. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She wasn't just someone kind who took care of him. She was his mother. He now saw all the clues he had missed before, the way she always protected him, how she knew exactly what made him feel better, how she never left his side when he was sick. All those moments meant something more now, and it also explained Richard's behavior. Richard didn't want Ethan to know the truth. Maybe he was ashamed or angry or scared. Whatever the reason, Ethan was sure now that his father had been hiding something very important. But Ethan didn't feel confused anymore. The biggest question he had ever asked finally had an answer, even if it came without words. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his room. The lights were off except for the small lamp on his nightstand. He held his notebook on his lap, flipping through the pages filled with drawings, thoughts, and questions he had written over the months. All the old questions about his mother were there, circled and underlined. Now he grabbed a pencil and drew a simple check mark next to one of them. "Is Grace my mom?" He looked at the page and smiled softly. He didn't need to ask anymore. He didn't need to wonder. That hug, that silence, that moment on the laundry room floor, it was enough. It gave him the truth he had been searching for. Richard could keep avoiding it. The staff could keep quiet. But Ethan knew now. As he closed the notebook and placed it beside his bed, he felt more sure of himself than ever. The doubt was gone. The truth was clear. And that changed everything. Richard stood by the window in his office, looking out with a serious expression. He didn't seem calm. He looked tense, almost angry. On his desk were papers, contracts, and files, but he wasn't focused on any of them. He had called Grace to speak with her, and when she entered the room, she could feel the pressure. The door closed behind her, and Richard didn't waste time. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. "Ethan is asking questions, and I know it's because of you." Grace didn't answer at first. She looked down at the floor. Richard stepped closer. "If you tell him the truth, if you say anything, you'll lose everything. Your job, your place here. You won't see him again." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "He already suspects, Richard. He's not a baby anymore." Richard shook his head. "You know why you had to stay quiet? I was about to close huge deals. Your presence would have destroyed everything." Hearing those words again brought back the memory of the worst day in her life. She remembered clearly the moment she was told she couldn't be a mother to her own son. Not in public, not in any official way. Richard had looked her straight in the eye back then and said that if she wanted to be near Ethan, she would have to accept the role of a maid. No name on paper, no title, no rights. Just the chance to stay close, even if it meant hiding the truth. Grace had agreed, even though it hurt deeply. That memory never left her. "You said it was temporary," she whispered now. "You said I could tell him one day." Richard didn't respond right away. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and began organizing his papers again like the conversation was over. "You had a choice," he said coldly. "You chose this life. Stick to it." "I chose it because I love him," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I didn't care about titles or money. I just wanted to be with him." Richard looked up at her again, this time with less anger but no sympathy. "I had a reputation to protect," he said. "Investors, meetings, media. If they found out I had a child with a woman who worked here, it would have destroyed everything." Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. After all these years, he still cared more about his image than about his son's right to know the truth. "You care more about your business than your own child?" she asked, shocked. "I care about stability," he answered. "And if you say one word to Ethan, you won't be around to see him grow up." The threat was clear. He wasn't just warning her. He was reminding her of how much power he still had. Grace left the office feeling sick. Her legs were heavy as she walked down the hallway. Each step reminded her of the secret she had carried for so long. She had done everything for Ethan. Every night she stayed by his side when he had nightmares. Every meal she made with care. Every birthday she planned quietly in the background. She had done it all without being able to call him son. And yet she never once stopped loving him. Not even when he called her by her first name, not even when he asked about his mother, and she had to pretend she didn't know. But now, things were changing. Ethan wasn't little anymore. He was starting to see the truth for himself. The questions were getting harder to avoid, and Grace knew she wouldn't be able to hold back much longer. She was tired of lying. She was tired of hiding. The fear that Richard had used to control her was starting to lose its grip. That night, Grace sat alone in her small room, staring at a photo she kept hidden in her drawer. It was the only picture she had of Ethan as a baby, taken before the arrangement with Richard was made. In the photo, she was holding him, smiling. She remembered how light he felt in her arms and how happy she was before things became complicated. Back then, she believed that love was enough to protect them both. But now, she saw how much damage silence had done. Ethan had grown up full of doubts. He had cried without knowing why. He had asked questions that no one would answer, and she had been forced to stand by, pretending everything was normal. Grace picked up the photo and pressed it to her chest. She whispered to herself, "I'm sorry." She had wanted to keep him safe, but maybe keeping the secret had hurt him more. Maybe it was time to choose truth over fear. As Grace looked out her window, she realized the weight she carried was no longer bearable. She couldn't keep doing this, watching Ethan suffer, watching him search for answers with no help. He deserved to know who he was. He deserved to know who she was. Richard's threats still scared her, but something had changed. Ethan had grown stronger. He had started putting the pieces together. And now Grace was beginning to believe that telling the truth wasn't just a risk. It was a necessity. She couldn't keep pretending forever. One day soon, Ethan would ask again, and this time she would have to give him a real answer. The fear of losing him had kept her quiet, but the fear of letting him live in confusion was stronger now. As she wiped her tears, she made a silent promise to herself. The past was painful, but it couldn't stay hidden forever. She knew deep inside she couldn't keep the secret for much longer. Ethan had been feeling uneasy for days. Something wasn't right. Grace had been acting more nervous, and Richard was even more distant than usual. Ethan started watching both of them more carefully. He noticed the way Grace avoided eye contact when he brought up anything about his past. He also saw how his father always ended conversations quickly when certain topics came up. One afternoon, Ethan walked slowly down the stairs but stopped when he heard voices. He crouched behind the staircase, staying completely still. From where he hid, he could hear Richard talking to Grace. His voice was low but firm. "You know what would happen if he finds out," Richard said. "If this gets out, we'll lose everything. He can never discover the truth." Grace said nothing. Ethan's heart raced. He didn't understand every word, but the word discover stood out. Discover what? Discover who? That word stuck in his head like glue. Something was being kept from him, and he knew it now. Ethan stayed hidden for a few more seconds, listening, but the conversation ended quickly. He tiptoed back upstairs, his mind spinning. What was it that his father didn't want him to discover? Why did Grace look so scared when Richard spoke to her like that? It felt like everyone in the house knew something he didn't. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he heard. He didn't understand all of it, but it confirmed what he already felt. There was a secret, and it was about him. After turning in bed for a long time, he sat up, grabbed his notebook, and wrote one sentence. "What does my father not want me to find out?" The question stayed in his head like an alarm. He decided it was time to ask again. He couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. He needed to know the truth. He had waited too long already, and this time, he was ready to push harder. The next morning, Ethan looked for the right moment to talk to Grace. He waited until she was alone in the laundry room, folding clothes in silence. He walked in slowly and stood beside her. "Grace," he said, looking up at her, "can we talk?" She nodded and smiled gently, but her hands didn't stop folding. "You're hiding something from me," Ethan said firmly. "I heard Dad say I can't discover something. What is it? I think you're my mom. I feel it. I know it." Grace's hands stopped moving. She closed her eyes for a moment and tears rolled down her face. She didn't answer right away. Ethan stepped closer. "Please just tell me the truth." Grace knelt in front of him, took his hands in hers and whispered, "I wish I could tell you everything, Ethan. I really do." Her voice cracked. She pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. Ethan didn't cry, but inside, he was shaking. She hadn't denied it. Grace's reaction gave Ethan more certainty than any spoken answer. He could feel it in the way she held him, tight, warm, and full of emotion. It wasn't just a hug. It was the kind of hug only a mother gives her child. He didn't ask anything else in that moment. He stayed still in her arms, listening to her quiet sobs. He could feel her chest moving as she cried. Her words had been few, but her silence said even more. She wanted to tell him. She was just afraid, probably because of Richard. Ethan now understood that the truth was real and it was being locked away. He also realized that if he wanted answers, he would need to find them himself. Grace would never lie to him, but she was trapped. She was scared of what might happen if she told him too much. Ethan let her go slowly, looked into her eyes, and made up his mind. He was going to look for proof. The rest of the day, Ethan kept thinking. He replayed the moment behind the stairs again and again. He thought about the word reputation that Richard used. What did that mean? Why would Ethan knowing the truth ruin anything? He remembered his father's cold response at breakfast and how angry he got when Ethan brought up Grace. That wasn't normal. A father should want his son to know about his mother, not hide her. Now Ethan was sure everything Richard said was a cover-up. From now on, Ethan stopped trusting his words. If his father said something, Ethan would question it. If his father told him not to do something, Ethan would wonder why. His trust in Richard was broken. Ethan started planning in his head. He would go through old rooms, drawers, anywhere that might have a clue. Maybe there were pictures hidden, maybe papers, maybe even letters. He wasn't just a curious boy anymore. He was searching for the truth. That night, Ethan sat in bed with the light off. He wasn't tired. His body was still, but his mind was wide awake. He remembered how many times he had asked simple questions and got nothing in return. Now it all made sense. The strange looks, the silence, the way people changed the subject. It was all part of the secret, a secret he was never supposed to find out. But it was too late now. He had heard enough. He had felt enough. The truth was right there, just behind the door, and he was going to open it, no matter what. He didn't blame Grace. In fact, he loved her more now. She had been doing the best she could in a bad situation. But Richard, that was different. Ethan no longer saw him as a guide or protector. Now, Richard was the one hiding the truth. Ethan promised himself that the next time he found something suspicious, he wouldn't ignore it. He was ready. Ethan wasn't supposed to be in the office that day. Richard had left in a rush, and the door was left slightly open. The room was usually off-limits, filled with books, papers, and important-looking objects. But Ethan was bored and curious. He stepped in slowly, running his fingers across the old desk, touching pens, paperweights, and picture frames. Nothing looked interesting until he knocked over a pile of books while reaching for a pencil. As he picked them up, he noticed a small, dusty box tucked behind the row of books. It looked forgotten. Carefully, he pulled it out and sat on the floor. The box was metal, old, and slightly dented. He opened the lid and found something strange, a round, gold-colored medallion. He held it in his hands, noticing its weight. When he opened it, he saw a photo inside. One side showed a young Grace, smiling, standing next to a much younger Richard. On the other side, there was a short message, "For our baby who is coming." His fingers traced the words again and again, "For our baby who is coming." He read it slowly, trying to understand exactly what it meant. There was no doubt in his mind. That message was about him. The photo, the writing, the fact that it had been hidden away, it all connected. He didn't feel confused. He felt something closer to shock, but also relief. For the first time, he was holding something real, not just a feeling, not just a guess. This was a piece of his history. He stood up quickly, gripping the medallion tightly, and rushed out of the office. He didn't want to wait. He had to talk to Grace immediately. She was in the kitchen, wiping the counter, when Ethan entered. He walked straight to her and placed the open medallion in her hand. "Is this true?" he asked, looking her in the eyes. Grace looked down at it, and then she started to cry. She didn't try to hide her face or hold back the tears this time. She dropped the cloth she was holding and sank slowly into the chair behind her. Ethan stood still, waiting. Grace held the medallion with both hands, her thumbs gently rubbing the edges. "Yes," she said quietly through her tears. That one word said everything. Ethan didn't need more. He felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, joy, anger, and peace, all happening at once. She wiped her eyes and tried to say more, but just as she opened her mouth to speak again, the door to the kitchen slammed open. Richard stormed in. His face was red with rage. He looked at Ethan, then at Grace, then at the medallion. Without saying a word, he stepped forward, yanked it out of Ethan's hands, and turned toward Grace. "How dare you?" he shouted. His voice echoed. "You promised to stay quiet." Grace didn't move. Ethan stood in front of her, this time not afraid. Richard was shaking with anger. He pointed at Grace and continued yelling. "You broke the deal! I told you! He was never supposed to know!" Grace didn't answer. She stayed silent, but her eyes were wet and locked on Ethan. Richard turned to Ethan, still gripping the medallion. "This means nothing," he said. "It's just an old picture." But Ethan didn't believe him anymore. He had seen the truth. The message in the medallion, the way Grace reacted, the way Richard panicked. It was all too real to ignore. "You lied to me," Ethan said firmly. "All this time." Richard tried to respond, but Ethan stepped back closer to Grace. "She's my mom," he said. "I don't care what you say anymore." Grace covered her mouth, sobbing again. Richard threw the medallion on the table and left the room, slamming the door behind him. The room stayed quiet. Ethan walked over, picked up the medallion again, and placed it gently in Grace's hands. "I believe you," he whispered. Grace looked at Ethan like she was seeing him for the first time. Her tears slowed, and she nodded silently. There was no need to hide anymore. Ethan knew. He had the proof. She pulled him close and hugged him tight. This hug felt different than all the others. It wasn't full of worry or fear. It was full of truth. For a long time, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. After a few minutes, Grace whispered, "I always wanted to tell you. I just wasn't allowed." Ethan nodded. "I understand," he replied. "But now I know." The medallion stayed in Grace's hands, as if it had finally returned to where it belonged. Ethan sat next to her and held her hand. They were quiet, but everything had changed. For years, they lived under a lie, but that small object had brought the truth out. Nothing could erase what Ethan saw, and nothing Richard said could change how he felt now. The day had started like any other, but now everything was different. Ethan had entered that office out of curiosity. He had knocked over some books by accident, and behind those books he had found a box that changed his life. The medallion wasn't just an object. It was a piece of the past, proof of a hidden truth, a connection that no one could deny anymore. The picture of Grace and Richard smiling together, and the message written with love. It was meant for Ethan all along. Richard could scream, lie, and even try to take it away, but he couldn't change what it meant. Ethan had seen enough. He had heard enough. And now, he had touched the truth. As he sat with Grace, watching her hold the medallion close to her chest, he no longer felt lost. Grace wasn't just a kind woman who cared for him. She was his mother. That fact was no longer a guess. It was real. It was proven. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, gripping the medallion tightly in his hand. His heart was beating fast, but his face was calm. Richard was sitting on the couch, reading the newspaper, like everything was normal. Ethan took a deep breath and walked closer. "We need to talk," he said. Richard looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his son's voice. Ethan raised the medallion so his father could see it. "You lied to me," he said, his voice clear. "You lied my whole life. Why did you hide my mother from me?" Richard opened his mouth but said nothing. He stared at the object in Ethan's hand, realizing this moment had finally come. Ethan didn't wait. "Why did you do it? Why did you make me think she was just the maid?" Richard sighed heavily. His hands were shaking now. The usual power in his voice was gone. "Because I thought I was protecting you," he finally answered. Richard stood up slowly, walking toward Ethan. "I did what I had to do," he said, trying to stay calm. "Grace is your mother, yes, but I didn't want you to grow up in the middle of something messy. I didn't want the media, the business world, everyone asking questions. I've worked my whole life to build a reputation, to keep our name strong." Ethan didn't flinch. He looked straight at his father. "So you picked your name, your company, your success, instead of telling me the truth. You picked money instead of your own son." Richard frowned. "It's not that simple." Ethan's hands were shaking now. "It is for me. You let me grow up thinking my mother didn't exist. You let me believe she didn't care, that she wasn't part of my life." Richard looked away, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. The walls of control he had always built around him were starting to fall apart. He looked smaller now, less sure. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. He didn't try to wipe them away. He wanted his father to see his pain. "Do you even understand what you've done to me?" he asked, voice breaking. "I had questions for years. I cried for someone I thought didn't want me, and she was here the whole time. You let her pretend to be a servant while I begged to know who my mum was." Richard reached out a hand. "Ethan, I didn't mean for it to be like this. I was trying to keep things peaceful." But Ethan stepped back. "You weren't trying to keep anything peaceful. You were trying to keep your image clean." At that moment, Grace entered the room. She saw the two standing there, Ethan hurt, Richard speechless. Without hesitation, she walked over and put her arms around Ethan. This time, she didn't care who was watching. She held him with all the love she had hidden for years, and Ethan hugged her back. Grace stood tall, no longer afraid of Richard's judgment or threats. She had stayed silent for too long, but now the truth was out, and she wasn't going to pretend anymore. Ethan stayed close to her side. Richard, seeing them together like that, looked helpless. For years, he had controlled everything. What was said, what was done, who stayed close, who stayed silent. But now, nothing he said could fix this. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said again weakly. Grace looked at him and answered calmly, "No, you were doing what was best for you." Richard looked down. He had no more words. Ethan saw him clearly now, not as a powerful man, not as a strong figure, but as someone who had been afraid to face the truth. The room was quiet. No shouting, no more lies. Just a broken silence that showed how far things had gone. Ethan now understood who his father really was, and who he wasn't. Ethan didn't feel better, but he did feel free. The truth hurt, but it also cleared away the confusion. He had lived in doubt for so long, always wondering, always guessing. Now he knew, and now that he knew, he could begin to move forward. He looked at Grace. Her eyes were tired but full of love. "I believe you," he whispered again. She held his hand. Richard watched them from across the room, silent. The power he had once used to control everyone around him didn't work anymore. His secrets were no longer hidden. The medallion, the one thing he had tried to keep buried, had brought the truth to light. Ethan had found it, faced the lies, and now stood stronger than before. Richard tried one last time. "Maybe we can talk about this calmly later." Ethan didn't respond. He turned toward the stairs with Grace beside him. The conversation was over. What needed to be said had already been said. Nothing more mattered now. As Ethan walked up the stairs with Grace at his side, he glanced back one last time. Richard was still standing there, alone. For the first time, he looked different, not like the powerful man who controlled the house, but like someone who had lost everything that really mattered. Ethan didn't feel hate. He didn't feel revenge. He just saw the truth. His father had built a life of silence, image, and pride. But none of that could replace love, honesty, or family. And now all of Richard's power couldn't erase what had been done. Ethan held the medallion tightly in his hand, not because he needed proof anymore, but because it reminded him of what was real. Grace wasn't just a part of his life. She was the center of it. As they reached the top of the stairs, Ethan felt something change inside. He had faced his biggest fear, and for the first time, he saw his father for who he truly was, vulnerable and broken. Everything changed after the truth came out. From that day forward, Grace was no longer treated as just a worker in the house. The other staff stopped calling her by title, and even Richard, though silently, backed off from treating her like someone beneath him. Grace was now seen for who she truly was, Ethan's mother. She no longer served meals in silence or cleaned rooms while hiding her connection to her son. Instead, she helped Ethan with his homework, sat beside him during dinner, and tucked him into bed without pretending it was part of her job. Ethan felt different too. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged to someone. That quiet feeling of emptiness that used to follow him around was slowly disappearing. Still, as happy as he was to be close to Grace, he couldn't ignore the sadness he felt about the years that had been lost. Years they could never get back, no matter what happened now. Ethan tried to enjoy the new moments with Grace. They spent time walking through the garden, talking about simple things, and laughing in ways they never could before. But sometimes, even in the middle of these peaceful moments, Ethan would grow quiet. Grace noticed. She understood that he was still processing everything. One afternoon, he finally said what he had been feeling inside. "Why did we waste so much time, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. Grace didn't have an easy answer. She held his hand and said, "I did the best I could with what I had, but I wish things had been different too." It wasn't anger Ethan felt. It was grief for the time that was stolen from them. Even though they were together now, he still remembered the birthdays, holidays, and lonely nights when he didn't know she was his mother. Grace promised him they would make new memories now, better ones, and never be forced apart again. That was her vow. While Ethan and Grace were trying to heal, Richard didn't accept the new reality so easily. He was no longer the respected, untouchable man of the house. His power didn't work the way it used to. Ethan no longer looked up to him or trusted him. That loss hurt Richard more than he expected. He tried to fix things by acting like nothing had happened. He offered Ethan gifts, suggested family dinners, and tried to pull Grace back into old routines. But nothing worked. Ethan was polite, but distant. He didn't forget what Richard had done. The man who once demanded silence and obedience was now being ignored by his own son. Richard grew frustrated and angry. One evening, he raised his voice at Grace and accused her of turning Ethan against him. "You poisoned him with your story," he said. Grace didn't back down. "You did that yourself," she replied calmly. Ethan, hearing it all, stepped in. "I chose her," he said, "not because of stories. Because she's my mom." Richard, feeling cornered, started threatening legal action. He called lawyers, made comments about custody, and even said things like, "He's still my son, and I have rights." Grace stayed calm, but Ethan was tired of the fighting. During one of the worst arguments, Richard yelled, "I won't lose him." Ethan stepped forward and said firmly, "You already did." That moment hit hard. Richard stood frozen. The boy who used to run to him was now standing against him. Ethan made it clear he wasn't going anywhere without Grace. No court, no threats, and no deals would make him leave her side. Grace held him close, proud but sad that things had come to this. Richard had chances to make things right, but every time he chose pride over love. And now he was paying the price. The house that used to feel controlled and perfect now felt broken, divided, but Ethan didn't care anymore. He knew where he belonged, and it wasn't with lies. Over time, the shouting stopped. Richard grew quiet. He no longer barked orders at the staff or walked around like a king. He stayed in his office most days, barely talking to anyone. Ethan still saw him sometimes, but the connection between them had faded. It wasn't hatred, it was distance. There were no more attempts to win him over. Richard seemed to understand that something had been lost forever. Meanwhile, Ethan and Grace focused on building something new. They took small steps, cooking together, going to the park, even planning a trip to visit her old hometown. Grace began smiling more. Ethan started laughing without forcing it. They were becoming a real family. Not one based on roles or secrets, but on truth. There were still painful memories, but they were no longer heavier than the hope they had. Grace would never again pretend. Ethan would never again question her place in his life. Together, they started to imagine what a better future might look like. Even though the future was still full of unknowns, one thing was certain. No amount of money, power, or control could replace the love between a mother and her child. That love had survived silence, fear, and years of distance. It had stayed alive through bedtime stories, quiet hugs, and whispered lullabies, even when Ethan didn't know who she really was. Now that everything was in the open, that love had become stronger. Richard had tried to buy peace with control, but in the end, he was left alone with his decisions. Grace and Ethan, on the other hand, stood side by side, ready to move forward. Maybe they would leave the mansion someday. Maybe they'd start a new life somewhere else. The future didn't have to be clear. It just had to be honest. What mattered now was that Ethan no longer had to ask who his mother was. He knew, and he had chosen her. Nothing Richard could do would ever change that again. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.